All right, let's bring in Nader Hashemi, who's a professor of Middle East politics. He's at Georgetown University. Nader, good to see you. First of all, let me start with the targeted military incursion into Rafah. Does not seem to be a full-scale military invasion. What are we to make of that?
Well, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is very much being driven here by the hawkish members, neo-fascist members or fascist members of his right-wing coalition, that if he doesn't go into Rafah or if he agrees to some sort of ceasefire, those right-wing members are going to bolt from the coalition. That will force elections, and that's effectively the end of Benjamin Netanyahu's career. At the same time, he's under some pressure from the Americans that they're not going to supply him with the weapons that he wants to carry out the full-scale invasion that I think he aspires to accomplish. So I think these are some of the dynamics that are happening here. Of course, the civilians in Gaza pay the big price once again. Reports coming out of Rafah are of horrendous conditions that have been inflicted on Palestinians, especially since all the border crossings now are effectively closed and no aid is getting in.
The other thing I'm curious about is, this message from Joe Biden. If this turns into a full-scale invasion, we are going to start suspending weapons shipments. And that kind of builds off the story, Nader, you and I were speaking about earlier this week, where, word came down that, in fact, the U.S. did postpone anyway a shipment of about 3,500 bombs to Israel last week amid concern over what might happen to Rafah. What does this mean for the U.S.?
Well, it means that the United States, I think we're coming to sort of a critical point here. I think the United States wants to wrap this up. It wants to see a ceasefire. And I think Biden, for the first time, is actually establishing some consequences for Israel if it carries on with this war. So I think in many ways, I think the future of Gaza, the future of this conflict are going to be determined perhaps over the next week or so, where, Biden is sending clear messages really for the first time to Israel that they don't have unconditional U.S. support for what they're doing in Gaza.
Okay, let me take a step back. We know that, of course, the American military is building some kind of a humanitarian pier on the Mediterranean to try to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza to help all of those civilians who are trapped in this conflict zone. We know that the Kara Shalom border crossing has been reopened as well. How do you conduct a military operation while still making sure that hundreds and hundreds more trucks are getting in there to help those who are in now desperate need? I mean, can you actually do that? So far, the answer would seem to be no.
That's a good point, Todd. You can't get humanitarian aid to people who need it while a war is raging. So there has to be a ceasefire, and that's what the CIA director is trying to, I think, negotiate right now in Cairo. So even if you build a humanitarian pier, and even if all the border crossings into Gaza are opened, you can't distribute the aid to the people who need it, which just highlights the need for a ceasefire and for intense diplomacy to try and move this horrendous situation in Gaza in a positive direction.
Yeah, we're going to show the map once again, Nader, where you and I are speaking. You're very familiar with the region, of course. We see Rafah there bordering Egypt, and of course that border was closed by the Israelis. No doubt they were worried that Hamas militants were going to try to escape down into Egypt, but they are again leading to delays in humanitarian aid shipments going in and out. Your thoughts on what's happening in Egypt, in Cairo, and these ceasefire negotiations? And, it strikes me that both sides do have some reason to want to have a ceasefire, but both sides also have reasons to continue the conflict forward.
That's correct. It seems like the two sides are pretty close. There's an agreement on the early phases of the conflict, some exchange for hostages in exchange for a ceasefire, and then a further exchange of hostages if the ceasefire is extended. But the sticking point, Todd, seems to be over, the final status of this war. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire and a withdrawal of Israeli troops. Israel doesn't want to end the conflict until it eradicates Hamas. So it's really those longer term issues, the final status issues of this war, whether we're going to have a pause or a permanent ceasefire, that are the sticking points at this moment.
Nader Hashemi joining us from Georgetown University. Hey, Nader, appreciate this. We'll talk again real soon.